I worked as a custodian at a high school for 3 years. Being the newest guy on the team, I got stuck with most of the overnight shifts. The building was huge, 4 floors and 2 gyms. At night when it was empty, it felt like a giant maze. The rule was to go floor by floor, room by room, turning off lights, emptying trash, and locking doors. It usually took the whole night to cover everything. If you tried to rush, you'd miss something. One Friday night, I was working alone because another custodian had called out sick. Normally we worked in pairs, so I wasn't used to being the only one on duty. At first, the shift was normal. I started on the first floor, emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, and mopping the hallways. The lights in some of the old corridors flickered, making the shadows jump around, but I told myself it was just the building settling. Around midnight, I made my way up to the 3rd floor. That floor always gave me a bad feeling because it was quieter than the others. It had a lot of older classrooms that weren't used anymore, some permanently locked, others just storage rooms filled with dusty books, broken furniture, and old lab equipment. As I walked down the hallway, I passed the lockers. The metallic click of the doors and the echo of my boots against the tiles made me jump a few times. I kept reminding myself it was normal. I was halfway through mopping one of the main hallways when I noticed a door about 20 feet away was open. That struck me immediately because I'd already checked all the rooms earlier in the evening, and every door had been locked. My first instinct was to walk past it quickly and ignore it, but something made me stop. I set my mop against the wall and walked over slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The door was one of those old wooden classroom doors with square glass window. I pushed it open slowly, shining my flashlight inside. The room looked empty. Desks were stacked along the walls, and boxes sat in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. But then I noticed that one of the boxes near the back wall had been moved. It was tilted, not lined up with the others, and there were scuff marks on the floor like it had been dragged across the tiles. My stomach sank. I knew I'd closed that door earlier, and I knew I hadn't moved that box. I told myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks because I was tired. I pulled the door closed and went back to mopping, but my mind kept wandering to that room. I kept thinking I should check the windows. Maybe a student had snuck in somehow, but all the windows were locked from the inside, and the hallway doors were locked as well. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched and focus on cleaning. After finishing that hallway, I went down to the stairwell to head to the 2nd floor. As I walked past that same classroom again, my heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had shut it before. I slowly stepped closer and peeked inside. The room looked normal, except the box was now moved to the center of the floor. My pulse was racing. I whispered, "Hello? Who's in here?" My voice sounded tiny in the emptiness of the building. I waited, but there was only silence. And then, from the back of the room, I heard slow, deep breathing. Not a gust of wind or a pipe. It was someone trying to be quiet, but making sure I could hear it. I tried to convince myself it was a student hiding, playing a prank. But how would they have gotten in? I was the only one who was supposed to be there, and all the doors were locked. I slammed the door shut and ran down the hallway to the stairwell. My heart was hammering, and sweat ran down my back. I stayed pressed against the stairwell door, listening. I debated calling my supervisor, even though I hated bothering him in the middle of the night. Finally, I did. When he picked up, I told him what was happening, trying to keep my voice steady. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. I stayed as far away from that room as possible, peeking over my shoulder every few seconds. Finally, he arrived. We went back up together. He had a big flashlight and walked straight into the classroom. The box was still in the middle of the floor. We checked everywhere, the closets, under the tables, behind the desks. There was nothing. He suggested I was just tired or imagining things. I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd heard, that slow, heavy breathing. I tried to finish the rest of my shift with him there, but I kept glancing at that classroom. The hallway felt colder and more oppressive than ever. Even sweeping and mopping didn't distract me. Every time I pass a locker, I expected it to swing open. Every shadow seemed like a person standing just out of view. Weeks later, when I worked with another custodian, he told me that years ago, a student had been caught hiding in that classroom overnight. They'd snuck and play a prank, but it scared the staff so much that they never used that room again. It made sense, but it didn't explain the breathing I heard that night. There was no one else in the school. I finished the shift and left, but every time I thought about it, my stomach twisted. I started taking extra precautions. I made sure all the doors were locked as I passed. I kept my flashlight pointed at the floor and stayed near the stairwell if I had to pass that hallway. Months later, I had another overnight shift alone. I avoided that third floor for as long as possible. When I finally had to go up, I moved as quickly as I could. I kept thinking I'd hear it again. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Even when I was in a room far from that classroom, I felt like eyes were on me. Every creak of the floor made me jump. I finished the shift and left quickly, never looking back. I refused to work that floor alone again. Even years later, I avoided it whenever I could. I never found out if it had been a student hiding or something else. But I'll never forget the sound of that breathing coming from a classroom that should have been empty. I can still hear it in my head sometimes.